past, when I've discussed books that I've published, I use terms like full-length collection and chapbook, but what do those terms mean and why do they matter? Welcome to Writing Concepts Explained, where I break down common terms writers use to talk about their work. Today's concept is chapbook. Chapbooks can run from anywhere from just 10 to up to 30 pages. While a debut full-length poetry collection introduces the poet to a wide audience, the chapbook can be seen as kind of a preview, a way to tiptoe your way into the literary publishing world. It's also a great way to gather stylistic or thematically similar work in one place. While a chapbook can be quite brief, just 15 or 20 pages, a full-length poetry collection is at the shorter end about 48 pages, and at the longer end anywhere from 80 to even 100 pages. Often, chapbooks are bound differently than full-length collections. Sometimes they are stapled, like here, and sometimes they are saddle-stitched, like here. It's very common to see these chapbooks created by hand. They are often an artisan object. On the other hand, chapbooks are meant to be fairly easy to produce, which means that it's pretty easy to disseminate your work to a wide audience. There are plenty of self-published chapbooks, but there are also a lot of literary presses that have chapbooks as part of their catalog. There are even some really incredible small presses that are dedicated totally to the chapbook as a form. They put a lot of love into curating and designing and publishing these brief and beautiful works. In a recent AWP talk, the poet Kwame Daw said, essentially, a chapbook is a technology, and it's an answer to a question of opportunity. It's not like chapbooks pay a whole lot. You can usually buy one for about $10 to $15, but they do offer a broad financial opportunity for poets looking to publish outside of the mainstream, as well as easy access to the written work of your local community. There are many names for the chapbook. In the past, I've made a video series about zines. And you might be wondering when I say the word chapbook, well, you know, it's a brief literary form. What's the difference between a zine and a chapbook? The truth is, I don't really know. I don't know if there is a big difference. Of course, zines are associated with a particular DIY and punk aesthetic, and sometimes chapbooks use a very particular mode of indie publishing, but the basic premise is the same: to affordably and easily disseminate your artistic and creative work. Different communities use different words to describe the same concept. In the United Kingdoms, for example, publishers rarely use the term chapbook. Instead, they call them pamphlets. This is a pamphlet from the UK from a very dear to my heart queer poet. And you'll notice about this, there's quite an austere design. You have the title, the poet's name, and then the publisher, Broken Sleep Books, on the back. And all of their books look like this. So they have a very particular aesthetic. And that's very common when you see a pamphlet that's printed in the United Kingdoms. The chapbook or pamphlet is an affordable form of literature that's easy to disseminate. In 1436, the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg, totally revolutionized the world of books. This allowed the mass production of cheap books, especially copies of the Bible, throughout the continent of Europe. But these books were mostly printed in the city, so they were largely inaccessible to rural farmers. You needed not just the money to buy these books, but also the space in your home to store them. And if you were a poor farmer back in the 1400s in Europe, you probably didn't have that space or that luxury. In the 1500s, booksellers had an idea to expand their market. They began to sell unbound pages, anywhere from 8 to 12 pages, and bring them into rural spaces. These were super cheap. They sold for less than a penny. Merchants took the pages from the cities to rural farmers and traveled from farm to farm. These merchants became known as chap men, which is where we get the term chapbook. The word chap came from the Old English word for barter, which also evolved into the word cheap. When we're talking about chapbooks, we are talking about cheap books, books that are easy to afford and get your hands on. Suddenly, rural and poor communities had all of these adventure stories and mystery stories to share. Most people at the time, of course, still could not read, but these stories were meant to be read aloud. So you would just buy one copy and then read it aloud and share the story with everyone for a very low price. This also meant, of course, that you didn't have to make room in your home for thousands of heavy books, which if you're a writer or a reader, you probably have that problem yourself. The availability of cheap printed materials directly led to a major spike in literacy during the 17th century, an era commonly referred to as the Age of Enlightenment. So the creation of the chapbook changed not just literature, but the world. I actually like to think about the original chapbooks as a form of fan fiction. They were very often adventures or steamy romances, sometimes even based on real people or mythological figures. And of course, there was even a major underground market for those spicy romances that you girlies are always talking about. Because the form was so easily disseminated, it became quickly political. By the 18th century, this kind of original origin of the chapbook to tell romances and fairy tales shifted. Instead, they became a vehicle to transmit Enlightenment era ideas. The 1791 pamphlet, The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine, which set the groundwork for democratic ideals, is a great example of the ways in which these short-form literary texts helped spread radical political ideas. Of course, the form was not only spreading radical and subversive ideas, the chapbook was also an easy way to spread morally didactic and religious lessons. These Christian pamphlets, which were called Sunday schools, aimed to sanitize and proselytize to the newly literate masses. In fact, that form of religious indoctrination in brief literary form is still around today in the form of Chick tracts, which are these short little cartoons that were created by Jack Chick to spread his conservative Christian ideas. As mass-produced paperback books became widely available in the 19th century, the popularity of the chapbook saw a sharp decline. You didn't have to buy these cheap unbound pages to get your adventures and your spicy romances. Instead, you could pick up a newspaper and find literature there, or even buy a small pulp novel. In the 20th century, chapbooks began to evolve even further. It was a form quickly adopted by radical writers and artists who romanticized, like I do, the history of chapbooks. And during this time, chapbooks became incredibly popular among a very particular literary genre, poetry. But in the 20th century, the form of the chapbook went through even more evolutions, spawning zine culture and becoming a publishing tool for poets. In the 20th century, the chapbook took on a new form among radical poets and artists. It was a way to spread avant-garde literature and art in a kind of antiquated way, in a very cheap way, a way that could be handmade by yourself without the need to access to expensive printers or presses. Especially in the realm of poetry, the, pressure to succeed with a, kind of poetry book just wasn't there in a chapbook because there were very small risks. There was not a huge financial risk that you were taking. So I think that poets started to experiment more with form and content and really expand what they wrote in the chapbook. It was a form of publishing that actually also really opened up the possibilities of what poetry itself could be. Around this time, poets were kind of making the sort of books that we associate with the term chapbooks today. It was a response to all of the poorly designed mass market pulp paperbacks. Instead, you could make something handmade and beautifully designed that was made by you and your friends. A lot of these writers believed that mass-produced books were too industrial. They alienated the reader, while if you are holding something that's made by hand, it connects you with the craft of not just writing, but also making books. Honestly, this is a reason I love artisanal chapbooks, ones that are saddle-stitched and specially made like this one, which is a chapbook that I wrote. But even this evolution only lasted a little while, because in the mid-20th century, something super important happened that, again, changed literature forever: the invention of the typewriter. The typewriter revolutionized publishing because it mixed together the ability to mass-produce books with that handmade feel. Writers now had the direct means of publishing production in their hands. All you had to do was type it up and then fold it and then hand it directly to readers. It was that simple. You didn't have to be some fancy artist to make a chapbook. Anyone could make one. For poets on the margin, poets who did not fit the status quo, poets who might have been pushed out of the traditional publishing industry, this revolution of the typewritten chapbook helped their words spread throughout the world. In the 1950s, anti-establishment poets, especially the Beat poet generation, sought to publish these chapbooks as a means to democratize the world of publishing. Chapbooks allowed lesser-known poets to publish and disseminate their work, especially from lesser-known publishers. One such well-known publisher is City Lights Publishers, founded by the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti. This press is responsible for creating the Pocket Poet series, a series that, as the name implies, is designed to fit in your pocket. These chapbooks are not meant to be pretentious or lauded or placed on a pedestal. They're meant to be read. Whether you're in a car or in the back of a dark dive bar, you could pull out little tiny books like this from your pocket and read them in a single sitting. And this Poet Pocket chapbook series published tons of famous writers today, like Anne Sexton and Jack Kerouac. The first chapbook I ever encountered was most likely Allen Ginsberg's Howl and Other Poems. The poem and book Howl was lewd and dirty. In fact, so offensive that the publisher Lawrence Ferlinghetti was taken to court for publishing pornography. And this book was my first ever exposure to contemporary poetry. I remember picking it up and thinking, that looks interesting, and I bought it for $2.08 at a Second and Charles. City Lights Publishers was just one of the first presses that really championed the chapbook as a form. But today, a lot of small presses are focused on the beauty and the possibility of the chapbook. They're cheaply made, they're easily disseminated, and they're so brief that you can consume them and read them in just a single sitting. And for that reason, chapbooks are still very popular today. Since the rebirth of chapbooks in the 1950s, the chapbook has taken on all of these really interesting experimental forms. So for example, there is a chapbook that is written on onion skin paper. It is so thin that the words bleed from one page to the next. There are other chapbooks that take advantage of its short form, so they include not just poetry, but art and comics and illustrations. In fact, although I'm loath to say it, the Instagram poets like Rupi Kaur have a lot of thanks and gratitude to give to chapbook publishers who were experimenting with mixing visual and literary text. In fact, the invention of the internet totally blew up the possibility of chapbooks. Suddenly, you can download chapbooks as PDFs from someone's website. There are even some really cool interactive chapbooks where the words move around on the page. A lot of poets are using the form to experiment and to rethink the possibilities of poetry. I think they're really neat. I think chapbooks are pushing the form of publishing and poetry further into the future. They're allowing us to embrace that DIY aesthetic and to continue to introduce new generations to poetry.